Well, in several ways, I think Orwell is right, or was right. Unifying factors behind family Britain. There seems to me a handful of key elements here. One which I won't labour, I think is important, is the essentially monocultural makeup of Britain in the first half of the 50s. Very little ethnic diversity. It was an overwhelmingly white population. Before 1954, immigration from the West Indies was running at only about 2,000 a year. The figures really started going up from the mid to late 50s. And then, of course, in 1962, there was the legislation that sought to curtail that growth in numbers. A black person, a person in England wasn't straight down the middle of the road, white as it were, was a very actual unusual sighting in almost every part. There's one or two copies in almost every part of Britain in the early to mid 50s. And I think one has to give some weight to that. The second way in which I think family Britain makes some sense as a concept, in that Orwellian sense, is the importance of the royal family as a unifying focus for society. And obviously the coronation in 1953 falls in this period. It's a hugely successful unifying event. In the Manchester Guardian, as it was still called, it changed its name to the Guardian a few years later. In the Manchester Guardian, the day after the coronation, the brilliant cartoonist, David had a cartoon called Morning After. And this cartoon showed a rather dazed, bloated family after they'd been watching the coronation on television. The result was an avalanche of letters to the Manchester Guardian, of which around 3/4 were outright hostile. I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples of these letters. From George W. Smith in Blackpool. The cartoon in today's issue besmirches the reputation of the Manchester Guardian forever. From Rodney M. Galley in Woodford, East London. I found Blair's cartoon Morning After almost incredibly tasteless and offensive. I am astonished that you should have seen fit to publish it. And from J.E. Haygarth of Bale in Yorkshire. I shall cut this cartoon out before I take my MG home tonight, as I should be ashamed to produce it to my wife and 2 small daughters. One commentator on the coronation was a brilliant man who you may have heard of, called Michael Young. He was the principal author of Labour's 1945 manifesto at the election where Labour won in a landslide and Attlee became Prime Minister. He then became a very distinguished sociologist in the 50s. He started in 1957 the Consumers Association and Which magazine, so signaling the start of the new consumerism, and he's really the founding father of the Open University as well. And he wrote a piece about the meaning of the coronation, and he argues in this piece that the emotional impact that the coronation made really does show the importance of the royal family and that deep social conservatism. He called it an act of national communion, a series of ritual affirmations of the moral values necessary to a well-governed and good society, and demonstrating that one family was knit together with another in one great national family through identification with the monarchy. So I think the royal family is important. I'm not saying it's unimportant now, but I think it was a lot more important, a lot more central in people's lives in the 50s. The third unifying element is, I think, it's very hard to quantify, but I think it's important and it's there. And it's national rituals. I think we've lost on the whole that sense of those important annual rituals. And I'm thinking things like sporting things, often like the cup final, or the Grand National, or the Derby, or ceremonial things like the Royal Tournament, or trooping of the car, or even actually the Queen's broadcast on Christmas Day. These things really mattered then. So they don't matter now, but they mattered a lot more then. And in this period, the Great Cup Final was 1953, when the most popular and celebrated footballer, Stanley Matthews, still hadn't won a cup winners medal, and huge national hope and expectation that this perhaps could be his year. By this time he was 38. And the team with Blackpool against Bolton, he played for Blackpool. And with 20 minutes to go, Blackpool were losing 3-1. And generally in my approach, I use diarists quite a lot, particularly obscure, unknown diarists, because I feel they tell one a lot. And one of my diarists was a housewife in Barrow, in Furness called Noah Last. She had no interest in sport whatsoever. And yet that afternoon, May the 2nd, 1953, that Saturday afternoon, she and her husband drove out from Barrow to a local beauty spot. And then, well, he went for a short walk. She stayed listening to the calm wireless, and this is what she writes in her diary. He was back soon after 4 o'clock. I said, I'm wrong, the horse standing matches isn't going to be in the cup final after all. One of the broadcasters then said, Bolton's the winner, they had 3 goals to Blackpool's 1. But then Blackpool will start coming back into the match. And she goes on, soon we were gripped by the intense excitement as the teams equalised. My husband said, there's still a chance. But we agreed it was out of a snowball in a hot stove, right to the very last minute. And then in that very last minute, Blackpool scored a new goal to win 4-3. And she goes, I found myself clapping heartily. I laughed aloud at sober working men who'd been listening in and near parked cars, doing a kind of little jig. So I think these national rituals mattered, and they did bind people, they did bind society together. The fourth element I mentioned is the deep insularity of British people at this time. In my view, a deep insularity, looking at diaries, and indeed at local newspapers and so on, I find very little evidence that people were particularly interested, or they often were particularly interested in events outside of their own immediate circumstances, their family and so on. Perhaps they were interested in their village or their town or their city. But they might not have been interested in the country at large. But they certainly weren't interested in what was going on the other side of the English Channel. Very little time for foreigners, very patronising, condescending attitude generally towards foreigners. After all, we just won two world wars in the space of a quarter of a century or so. There was an ingrained belief, often wholly unjustified, an ingrained assumption British is best about our manufacturers, our motor cars, for example, and a belief that the British way of life was somehow superior to other ways of life. If you forgive me, I'll just stick with the sort of thing for a moment, because later in 1953, there was an arguably even more celebrated or historic match when England went home to Hungary in November 1953, and England had never lost at home before this point, but Hungary were a winning team and a very skillful team. So there was a little bit of apprehension. In the Daily Mirror on the morning of the match, the football correspondent was convinced that, quote, moral courage would see the English through. It didn't. Hungary won 6-3, England's first home defeat. At the banquet after the match, the chairman of the Football Association was still cheerful. We are not downhearted and not disturbed by the defeat we have sustained, he said. The Hungarian Vice Minister of Sport was graciousness itself. We are looking forward to the coming visit of England to Hungary and hope you have better luck in Budapest next May. Well, next May duly came around, May 1954. Daily Mail this time, the football correspondent. No England team was beaten until the final handshake, but I have viewed other matches with greater confidence. Well, 7-1 this time, Hungary. And then later in 1954, the World Cup took place in Switzerland, and England made the quarter-final up against Uruguay. Again, the Daily Mail football correspondent. I seem to be the only person in Switzerland who gives England a chance. I feel they can win if they attack from the start. Well, Uruguay duly won 4-2, and the Daily Mail man was left to praise, inevitably, a gallant performance in a heartbreaking match, and to make a little obligatory flick at the prima donna attitude of certain of the Uruguayan players.